Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo, Burja, and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in.
Great. Well, please, let's get into it.
So I've been thinking a lot about the nature of cities in defining and shaping and being shaped by human society for almost a decade. One of the most striking features of the city is that it is the longest lived of all human institutions, if we consider it an institution. A city might stay in the same location through 5,000 or 6,000 years of history, and we don't have anything else with that kind of staying power. Now, of course, some of it is geography. You might just have people settle at a particularly good harbor, or you might have people start a settlement because of mineral deposits, or because the area is a key defensive chokehold or defensive point, defensible fortress, right, on the boundary of something. I think, though, that the deepest argument for the persistence and the sort of deepest explanation for the persistence of cities isn't the physical geography of nature, but rather the social geography of human society. People go to cities almost tautologically to be near other people. So no matter what kind of concentration of capital, knowledge, military power, religious authority, anything you can think of, is going to require the co-location of lots and lots of people because they have to be close, they have to work together. Also, cities at the end of the day are an interface layer between radically different institutions, right? If you consider a medieval city, a medieval European city, you might have the Guild of Craftsmen interact with both merchants and the nobility living outside the city that has a residence in the city. You have peasants who are sort of escaping the countryside to be laborers in the city, and they, if they can stay in the city for a year, their feudal obligations are gone. You'll have, you will have the prostitutes' quarter, like this whole stack of society. There's a microcosm of society physically co-located within this constraint of medieval city walls. It's in a way chaotic, but it also means that cities are a kind of meta institution, right? No matter what institutions exist in your society, they benefit from functional cities, and there is immense detriment to dysfunctional cities. There's a high cost that's paid. So much, I've used the metaphor for a civilization of composed of many trees, many social institutions, but a forest or an ecosystem might persist. It's telling that this metaphor works for the city as well. You might have a total transformation of religion, like happened with late antiquity, where the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus is abandoned, left to decay for a few years. Eventually, its marble is harvested to build new churches, and someday, on the same exact site, a totally new cathedral might come to be. The Roman religion, very different than the late Roman Christian religion, but still the location's preserved. The street coordinates of where you are in a city are essentially the coordinates of where you are in society, right? Desirable spots tend to remain desirable, even though that can change. Prestigious spots, places of political authority or centers of political authority persist. And this way you can slot out one institution, replace it for another, but the city continues.
What do you think is misunderstood or underappreciated about the city's role here? Is something people get wrong when they think about the proper role or its impact?
I think that in online discourse, at least, there's been a lot of critique of the dysfunction of modern cities, modern American cities in particular. This is hardly unique. Most of 19th century literature was talking about cities, how they're like, dens of crime, of vice, of corruption, of inefficiency, of, mass exploitation, etc. But the society was undergoing a great golden age. at the same time in the sense of an expansion of industrial production, rapid advances in technology. These were ascendant countries, right? The Paris and London that were super critiqued in the 19th century, these were ascendant cities, not descending cities. Now, this is not to say that some cities aren't in decline, genuinely in decline. But I think that whenever you hear of something extremely important or dynamic happening, and at the same time, something awful happening in the very same place, that's not necessarily a sign that the bad will outcompete or crush whatever positive or good is happening there. I think that cities are often places where all the best things you hear about it are true, and all the worst things you hear about it are true. And there's a bunch of mechanisms in which like dysfunction can get sort of sorted to a part of the city, but not spill over into the other part. Now, this isn't always sustainable, but I think people like to have like simple rise or decline stories. And the uncomfortable truth is that often something can be going very, very well in a city, and something else can be going very, very badly.
Here's a question I asked you. I remember at Hereticon a couple years ago, I tracked you down and asked you, why are cities often left wing, or why do they often have democratic leaders in power? How does that happen?
Well, I don't recall the exact answer I gave then, but it's still a very good question. So to answer it sort of directly, I think that there's a sort of specific explanation and a general explanation. I think the specific explanation is that the Democratic Party has a 20th century legacy of optimizing for cities, right? The sort of Tammany Hall sort of political machine model where you basically distribute patronage and exchange blocks of people, be they unions or like ethnic blocks or whatever, they vote for you and keep you in power. That's still in the DNA of the US Democratic Party. There's still cities that are run this way. There are cities that basically the city budget has become the Democratic Party's budget. I think that, this has been reinvented even in places without such a history. I think in San Francisco, there's absolutely massive taxation on huge wealth, right? On a huge amount of money generated by the tech community, redistributed into city government. And it's not even that the employees of the city government are themselves Democratic Party operatives. It's that all of that money is privatized in a way and given to a huge nonprofit complex. And this actually makes the San Francisco Democratic Party very powerful within the California Democratic Party. And in turn, the California Democratic Party is very powerful in national politics. So it's sort of this case where, someone who might seem like a failing politician that, screwed up a city, actually, maybe they're a super successful politician. They've redistributed money to their political allies, and they'll be rewarded by being promoted upwards. So the flip side of this, though, is that sometimes useful things get done. I think less so in recent years than they once did. But historically, this was the kind of operation that would cut through red tape, not create red tape. If you wanted to construct an extra mile of subway, some regulations got in the way. There was a productive kind of corruption where, since it's a construction company, the mayor might be associated with, well, maybe pressures applied here and there, and any sort of regulatory barrier to finishing the construction project is swept away for like 10 or 20% fee. In the America of the 2020s, where a mile of subway costs $1 billion, clearly this is no longer cost-effective corruption, right? And maybe we should hope for cost-effective corruption, because this sort of mass redistribution and appropriation of public funds, for basically enriching political allies has really broken down. So it's very difficult to politically defeat that. It has a functional variant where you're building lots of, public infrastructure, and a dysfunctional variant where you're raising ever more money to solve problems that never get solved. Like, for example, San Francisco homelessness, or crumbling infrastructure in New York, right? Or insufficient infrastructure in New York. But I think it's also a little bit the Republican Party's fault. I don't think the Republican Party in the 2020s offers anything to Americans living in cities. It promises, in theory, lower taxes. This is great, but they do not do anything to make cities livable. They have no positive program of elect us and we'll do something for the city. At best, they can offer being tough on crime. But you know what? A moderate Democratic Party candidate, can decide to be tough on crime too. Honestly, I think a tough on crime Democratic mayoral candidate is just really hard to beat. Like, I think that just is something that people, regardless of party affiliation, want currently. But I think it's on the Republican Party to sort of imagine what would a Republican city look like, because otherwise, all they do with their deregulation and pro-growth perspective is to take a red state like Texas, juice up economic growth, people immigrate into the state. Lo and behold, the people inevitably congregate in cities. And in cities, they realize that the only way they can vote to build up the city's infrastructure, build up beautiful parks, or build public transit of any kind, or do something about congestion, all of these first initial steps, it's like not clear the Democratic Party can deliver on that, but at least the Democratic Party promises that, right? And sort of the Republican Party only has this negative program of, oh, we'll get out of your way. Well, get out of your way is much more compelling if you live in a small town than if you live in a big city. In a big city, everyone is already in everyone's way. It takes a certain measure of authoritarianism, right, to run a city. And it can be justified in left-wing terms of like equity redistribution, can be justified in right-wing terms of like order, stability, efficiency. But ultimately, there has to be an offering. And I think on a structural level, there are very few cities in the United States you can point at that it's a successful city, it works well, and it's run by the Republican Party. And I think that, Miami might be an example of such a city, but Miami has very specific demographics and politics, right? The sort of Cuban anti-communist perspective is kind of dominant there. And this is Cold War, almost like legacy association, and this kind of a hedonistic culture, which, again, in the 2020s, hedonism and pro-sex almost codes not quite Republican, but sort of edgy right-wing, because sort of the mainstream is kind of prudish, mildly anti-sex compared to, say, the 1990s or early 2000s. So that's the general answer. Sorry, that's the specific answer for the United States. And for the general answer, I think in cities, inequality is most visible. So in cities, redistribution is always a popular position because you just see people with wealth and you don't have it. And I think this is as true today as it was in ancient Rome, right? So in ancient Rome, if you say that, the poor plebeians, they don't have any land, they're being squeezed into the city, we should redistribute land to them. That would be a popular position among the plebeians, of course, not the patricians.
We'll get back to the conversation in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Fast forward to the end of 2024. Think about your goals. What can you do right now to give yourself the best chance of succeeding? If learning a new language is on your list, you absolutely need to check out Babbel. Babbel offers a range of learning tools, self-study app lessons, live classes, and even podcasts, which have always been my favorite way to learn. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel isn't just a game to kill time and make you feel like you're learning a language. It's not overly academic or rigid either. It's all about learning language for the real world. Babbel stands out because it's designed by real people using a modern conversational teaching approach. It's not always easy, nothing worth doing ever is, but it's straightforward and designed to help you start speaking in just 3 weeks. With Babbel, I was able to brush up on my intermediate Spanish to ramp up for travel to Argentina last year, and was able to set clear goals based on how much time each week I wanted to practice. Join millions of Babbel language learners across all age groups. Here's a special limited time offer for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only at babbel.com/Torenberg. That's babbel.com/Torenberg, spelled BABBEL.com/Torenberg. Rules and restrictions may apply.
I'm curious what we think about kind of charter cities or network states in this light, because I've had the sort of, I think, contrarian opinion among people in that community that you'd have more leverage trying to move to San Francisco, get a few thousand votes, and try to change the politics of the city than moving people from San Francisco to Honduras or Africa or some other place where you can get some jurisdiction. Um, in the similar way that Elon, just took over Twitter or bought Twitter, as opposed to starting a new Twitter, which is very difficult once network effects have really taken over, which in cities, have habits. It's hard to move people, as we found out. I moved to Miami for 2 years. Not a lot of people followed. So I'm curious what you think.
I think that if you could get a few thousand people to vote as a block and you move them to a city, you're in fact extremely powerful. The tricky part is, would people actually vote that way? I think it requires kind of an identity. To some extent, I think Yimby did this very well, where Yimby said, hey, we know your commitments at the national level are democratic, but actually locally, pro-growth is good and anti-growth isn't, and we should build more housing. So Yimby being yes in my backyard, which is this sort of pro-upzoning, pro-construction ethos and activist movement, people identify with it. So they talk about it to each other and they read the same mailing lists. And when it comes time to vote, they know what the Yimby endorsed candidate is. So, in other words, to move to a city, I think there's no coherent sort of coordination mechanism. But I think if they come with an identity that votes a certain way, that can be a powerful bargaining chip. Now, the reason I think that exit can be powerful isn't so much that it puts pressure on the place you're leaving. It's that it offers the opportunity to build something different, where you maybe set the initial conditions differently, right? You structure the city government differently, or you get special exemption from regulations. Charter cities veer beyond just the matter of city government into sort of the domain of city state, into the domain of sovereign government. Charter cities are sort of a bypass for the super dysfunctional national politics of countries around the world. And for a place like, say, Nigeria, or for a place like Central America, I think a charter city, if well structured, where it provides public law and order, because, like, again, let's remember, it takes Bukele-like measures to, say, defeat drug cartels, right? If drug cartels are endemic. So there is, again, like I want to point out, there's an authoritarian aspect of maintaining public peace and order. This is also as true of ancient Rome or Greece of Athens as it is of today, or as it is honestly of modern New York City. And then perhaps you have favorable pro-growth regulations where it's sort of this economic growth is racing ahead to spin up the flywheel of lots and lots of people migrating to the city because it's manufacturing a lot, because living standards are high, because the streets are clean, there's no crime, you can make a lot of money. That sort of flywheel is sort of how New York and Chicago blossomed and grew in the late 19th century and the 20th century to the sizes today. Nothing prevents that from happening in, say, Honduras, if you had, say, migration from a wider region, a wider Spanish-speaking region. And in Nigeria or Africa especially, we know huge cities are going to happen. We know because there is still an ongoing population explosion. Most of the planet is old. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is sort of the only very high fertility part of the world left. I mean, there are a few small exceptions, like literally Afghanistan and I think Iraq. But in Africa, we know millions of people will move to cities, and there'll be many cities with over 5 or 10 million people. So if you know inevitably cities are happening just because there's a vast population pressure, farming doesn't make sense, people need and want jobs, jobs are found in cities, and any sort of industrialization would happen in the coastal areas of Africa because that's where it's easiest to ship goods onto the world market. If China has an aging population problem, it might not make sense to do lower end production in China, right? It doesn't make sense even today to do textiles in China the way they did them 30 or 40 years ago. It makes more sense to do them in Bangladesh, for example, right? That kind of industry develops on the coast. So as you have this huge population explosion in the hinterland, people move to the coasts for work. Also, human beings just love living next to the sea or the ocean. Worldwide, you look at it, something like 70% of urban population is coastal urban. So anyway, in those conditions, you might as well set the city politics to be most favorable, the most favorable you can make them. And then your city outperforms others. And I will note that sometimes it is precisely public infrastructure, almost like giga projects, that make a city viable. I don't know if you know about the history of New York with the construction of the Erie Canal, right? Before the connection was made to the Great Lakes region, actually, Philadelphia and places like that were bigger. Like there's a very slightly different timeline where that canal is not built, and New York is not the biggest city on the East Coast, and that'll be a really different America, really different civilization. So there's something really cool about the idea of going to a place that has an ongoing population explosion and that does not have a lot of infrastructure, and picking the cities. Like by picking those cities, those hubs, you will not just transform those cities. If you could do that, you'll transform those countries, maybe even make them real countries. A lot of these places have been very fragmented along tribal lines for a long time. State capacity is weak. A city government could be super powerful. Now, will this involve Silicon Valley packing up and moving to Charter City, Nigeria, or even Charter City, Honduras? No. I'm just almost certain to not. However, if someone could get a US state, or better yet, the US federal government, to designate a special economic zone somewhere in the US where the federal stuff would not apply for the purposes of perhaps reindustrializing the United States, I think people would move, and I think it would work extremely well. But the problem is that's the kind of thing that requires sort of the federal government to agree, or a state government to agree to give up power. And that's a very tricky thing to do politically.
The one thing you also write in your piece in Palladium, why the city makes a civilization, which people should read, is you talk about the effect of cities on social media. And there's, over the pandemic, there was sort of this thinking of, hey, everything is remote now. We live on the internet. But you actually, imply that it's way less like that. It's way more city dependent than we think. Why don't you unpack that a little bit?
Well, if you live in a city today, I think that you are also living in the city's digital counterpart. As the internet became ubiquitous, the difference between IRL and online collapsed. But this doesn't mean that your IRL location no longer matters. Being well connected in DC, New York, or San Francisco, will let you access influential users on the site formerly known as Twitter. And just DMing random people, if you're big on Twitter, even if they're prominent people, still works surprisingly well in those cities to meet new people. So what you have is this digital flywheel between social media, which people have used to keep in touch with their friends, and then meeting in person. And then finally, if you are meeting in person someone you've met through social media, this can have massive professional consequences. I know of people who have been, hired into top AI labs, right, because of their social media, right, because they were prominent and sort of funny, and then they applied for an engineering job, and it turned out they're a good engineer, for example, right? That kind of career aspect, you don't get the same opportunity if you participate on a media platform that's dominated by a single city as if you lived in that city. And I do have to admit, sometimes here in the wider Bay Area, it feels almost like Twitter IRL. People will like literally show up in a coffee shop and say that they know you from Twitter. I think that doesn't happen in Los Angeles. Or rather, people in Los Angeles will know you from Instagram or maybe TikTok or maybe YouTube, which again makes sense because the dominant industry of the city is sort of fame, right? It is the entertainment world, film, TV, music. Everyone in the city also, is famously beautiful. So status is accrued not by being, verbally witty or knowing, the right obscure technical facts. The status is conferred by being hot, and you then compete on that on social media as well. Now, to be clear, I'm sure that even in San Francisco, more users use Instagram than say X.com. However, I'm talking here about sort of the elite strata of that city, and I think we can map this worldwide, where every single prominent city has sort of an industry that's dominated by this or that social media. And note, when I said that the flywheel goes both ways, like if a major account sort of likes you and promotes your stuff, that's a good way to become a major account, whatever kind of influencer you are. So really, in Los Angeles dominates the lists of top Instagram accounts. You're basically far more likely to run, into a well-known influencer there than anywhere else. There's sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy also of like, where does your industry live? And different industries and different professions are represented differently in the online world.
How do you think your understanding of what makes cities great differs from other, the Jane Jacobs of the world or other sort of city or, sort of urban development thinkers?
Theorists.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that I tend to view cities as profoundly a mobilization or an expression of society, where it seems to me that the very political structure of a government often reshapes the city profoundly. I think that if you see a grid layout at any archaeological site anywhere in the world in its history, there is a central authority mandating that grid layout. Meanwhile, if you have a more natural layout that's, with these snaking little alleys and like chaotic buildings and so on, then okay, perhaps there is no city authority that's strong enough to do so. And, the grid layout is visible, of course, in modern American cities and many modern developments because it's very, rational, easy to administer. But it is something that has to be imposed. And I think you can sort of measure government strength through that way. I also think that cities are transformed not just by themselves, they're, again, transformed by the rest of the civilization they're embedded in through vast wealth transfers or through concentration. If you unify a great area politically, there tends to be a tendency that the secondary center in a polity is subsumed and cannibalized by the primary center. Over the course of, the conquests of Rome, of the Western Mediterranean, there were many cities developed, but never again was there a rival to Rome in the Western Mediterranean like Carthage was. You basically have one administrative political center, and even for economics, agglomeration effects benefit. Even in the Eastern Mediterranean, where you had a far greater economic and cultural basin, like in the Eastern Mediterranean, they say never assimilated people into the Latin language. Greek remained the lingua franca there. Alexandria's decline began straightforwardly with Roman conquest because its cultural importance was gone. The institutions the Ptolemies supported, including the Library of Alexandria, persisted, but because the work of maintaining an ancient library isn't in collecting scrolls, it's in replacing scrolls as they are destroyed. You have to hire people to manually copy them, right? Or they crumble. Papyrus is just not a very durable material. Parchment is not very durable either. The result is the intellectual aspect goes away. And anyone who's truly maximally politically ambitious will no longer stay in Alexandria, right? They'll go to Rome, even if they're Greek, right? Of Greek birth, they will go to Rome, try to get Roman citizenship, try to be on the good side of the patricians, try their hands at various positions in the Roman state. So I think over time, if you have this kind of political unification, secondary cities tend to vanish. And if you look at Europe, this seems true, right? Yeah, a long unified state like Russia, it has St. Petersburg, which, by the way, is a former imperial capital, but really, it's all about Moscow. And if you look at France, which is an old nation state, it's all about Paris. And every decade and every century, it becomes more about Paris. So it's this self-fulfilling thing. The few large European countries that have a diversity of cities that matter are countries like Germany and Italy. Germany and Italy only unified at the end of the 19th century, right? And, of course, Munich and Frankfurt and Berlin and all of these cities sort of matter. And it's hard to point out to the one city in Germany that matters because unification is so recent. But for example, if you look at something like Austria, it's clear only Vienna matters because the Habsburg realms in particular were unified for a longer time. China has had a very similar dynamic in its history. The sort of main reason China doesn't have one mega city is that the Chinese capital has moved so much historically, right? It moved in dynasties that were basically fighting the Mongols and the Huns and other historical people like the Manchu, etc. Those dynasties tended to have a capital more north. Meanwhile, dynasties that were not concerned with frontier security tended to have a southern, sometimes even inland capital. I do think that in, say, modern conditions, when a country's population growth is explosive, you can have more than one industrial center develop. When there's the first time, when you first have a massive rural population that starts industrializing and moves to the cities, in that first wave, many centers will come to be. I think that's what happened, honestly, with the United States, just that in the United States, instead of people moving from like the American countryside into American cities, which, by the way, today is happening. America is more urbanized today than it ever was. It was people from the countryside of Eastern Europe or the German countryside, right? There were people like going from Poland and Russia and coming over, going from like rural Sicily and coming over to New York City. That was also not just an immigration event. It was a urbanization event. These were people that did not live in cities. So people who lived in London or Paris, those are not the people that would move to New York, right? There were actually people who lived nowhere, a small village, a small coal mining village in Wales or a small farming village in Ireland. They're like, should I move to London? Well, my cousin moved to New York. I'm going to go to New York, right? So that's sort of the dynamic that's at play there. So the United States actually is unique for now because it has a diversity of cities. But one of the more contrarian predictions that I would make on the basis of this model of cities as these avatars, embodiments of the broader society is that, I think Washington, D.C., and this might strike Americans as dystopian, in the grand arc of history, I think Washington, D.C. will evolve to be America's Moscow. It'll evolve to be eventually the most important political city, military city, eventually media city, and so on. It might be overshadowed by, say, San Francisco if technology continues to be this central. But I note that currently, government offices are not packing up and leaving DC to go to SF. Rather, major technology corporations such as Amazon and Microsoft have created big headquarters in DC. And the recent pivot to American dynamism in Silicon Valley, which of course I support, I think a revitalization of American hard technology is necessary, and the military is a great client. But guess what? As soon as you're making the military your client, sure, you might want to recruit engineers and capital in San Francisco. But unless you're living in DC, good luck with sales. Like, good luck convincing the Pentagon guys to buy your drones rather than buy Raytheon drones. And again, Amazon, Microsoft, they do big deals with the government to provide cloud computing services. I predict, OpenAI will eventually also have an office in DC, unless Microsoft preempts them by basically offering, repackaged. Here's the joke: Microsoft's AI services are an OpenAI wrapper. So, but Microsoft has one of the best sort of lobbying, best lobbying efforts of any software company, kind of as a result of them getting burned so bad by antitrust in the 90s and early 2000s, but also because they were one of the first companies willing to do work for the US military, right? So you can see the mechanism where even DC might become not the primary tech center, but a secondary tech center, right? There's an Amazon HQ, all of this stuff I mentioned, that could happen. DC continues to be one of the faster growing American cities in raw population. And, the US government is what, 50% of GDP, the federal government? So really, I think that, that city, I think it's always a boon. It might be a bad sign for America, but it's sort of like, no matter whether it's a bullish period or a bearish period for the stock market, it's always bull market for government hiring in DC. Like, I don't think you ever really have. Like, the worst that can happen is that all the Democrats get fired and all the Republicans get hired, or all the Republicans get fired and all the Democrats get fired to like these government positions that are by appointment.
Side note to that end, if Trump wins, do you expect a radical change in sort of government staffing? What do you think about
You know what? If Donald Trump pulled a sort of a Tsar Peter the Great move and declared that the boyars of Moscow have become too dysfunctional, they're too uppity, they don't have the interests of the country at heart. We need to modernize, so we're making a St. Petersburg and leaving all of these powerful elites behind, and all the government offices are going to St. Petersburg, and when I have the best shipyard, tremendous shipyard, we're getting Italian architects to build beautiful neo-Renaissance buildings. I mean, the joke here writes itself, right? If you did something as radical as produced another federal city somewhere in the United States and just started moving bureaus there and left all the bureaus you wanted to disempower back in DC, that wouldn't drain the swamp. That would sink the swamp, right? Like, you can do a government reset that way. But, I don't think he's going to do that, even if you could have beautiful Trump hotels in the new capital. And related to that, that's why I think that he is ultimately not going to fire that many people. When you look at historically, the problem with firing lots of people in government is that you need a small, competent team behind you to hire them back in. So all of these efforts to shrink government actually usually mean that you have to take up a function that used to be done inefficiently but politically powerfully by 1,000 bureaucrats. You have to do with a smaller team of 100 bureaucrats, or you've just given up power and the power's left on the table and whoever comes next picks it up. So I don't think Trump has a team around him. I don't think he's worked very well with the Republican Party. And, I didn't necessarily, we could have an election episode if you want, but I think the great tragedy of modern American politics is that both the Democratic and the Republican Party, as institutions, are decaying. They are worse at sourcing talent. They're worse at formulating policy. They are worse at reforming government institutions. So this sort of a party system, it's not even that we're locked in the party system. It's that the party system has sort of lost control of the steering wheel of U.S. government. So I don't think the U.S. government is party driven, which means that it's party agnostic.
that? That makes sense. I want to go back to your piece, because you end the piece where you say, since our industrial civilization clearly needs a refounding, which maybe you may want to give a quick primer, many of our cities will need such a refounding as well. It will require a new Gilgamesh and perhaps a new Enkidu too, to overthrow the old order of cities and found them anew. Can you flesh that out a little bit of if you had a laundry list or could wave a wand and have any sort of leverage points that you would pull or influence or change? What might those be?
Just to explain a literary illusion not all viewers might be familiar with, I opened the article by looking at one of the oldest written myths that we have available today, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the oldest written myth that we have is also an epic of the city, because it begins with Enkidu, the wild man who used to hunt wild animals, moving to the city and, eating bread and drinking beer and like observing how strange the city is and getting into a wrestling match with Gilgamesh over Gilgamesh's tyranny. They eventually become best friends and, go adventure and so on until Enkidu is killed. But that's who Enkidu and Gilgamesh are. So what I am saying there is that perhaps we need to look at our cities with fresh eyes, and we do need to go back into the cities and overthrow existing city governments and install new ones and build new institutions there, because it is very difficult to reform the existing ones. And maybe that takes the form of a few thousand voters, or maybe it takes the form of intellectually persuading anyone who's talented that policies that you favor are good. So at the end of the day, you kind of infiltrate the expert class. Maybe it's much more striking, right? Maybe there's an American city that has this terrible crime wave, and there's some sort of DA, district attorney, mayoral, police alliance sort of brings order to the city, brings down crime, and that impresses the voters to a great degree, but is also politically powerful because the police department is empowered. I mean, I'm almost describing 1990s New York, right? With Giuliani and then Bloomberg continuing that policy that resulted in, honestly, the city being, if anything, safe and clean, and not sort of the chaotic or almost post-apocalyptic New York of the 1970s that was immortalized by Hollywood films of the era. So I further suspect that a lot of our cities are technologically behind the times. What does a city look like if it is designed from the ground up to be optimized around self-driving autonomous vehicles, right? I think it looks quite different. I think the physical layout of the city is different. There was a massive difference in the Western world between cities built in the 1900s, which was sort of, cable car era, subway era, and cities built in the 1950s. You contrast Los Angeles and New York. You could think of New York as operating and having inherited a walkable, public transit oriented city plan, overlaid with some sort of half-hearted attempts to transform it into a car city that honestly just made it work worse. But you can still see clearly that there's the floor plan of a city that's pre-automobile, pre-personal vehicle. 1950s Los Angeles is a personal vehicle city. What would a robo-taxi city look like? I think that we might see that in China. And as soon as self-driving cars become a major factor in American cities, I suspect some US city, maybe a city in Texas, will grow to a great degree because we'll adjust its traffic regulations to fit these vehicles. You can imagine a world where people don't own a private car. They just, traverse through app. They ask the app, hey, I want to go as fast as possible from point A to B. And the app might summon a car. It might have a shuttle with 20 other people stop by, or it might direct you even to a subway or something like that. Though I don't think that will make as much sense. I think roads with autonomous vehicles of various sizes could actually transit people extremely efficiently. One of the most inefficient things currently is that there's vast demand for parking space in cities. If you look from, just a satellite photo, an aerial photo of an American city, but also some of the recent Chinese cities, you'll notice parking takes up huge areas of space. As soon as you need to dedicate huge areas of space to parking, walking from point A to point B becomes longer. It becomes super difficult because you have to go all the way past all this parking that's put there for a shopping mall or even a corporate headquarters. With self-driving, you could easily have a car drop you off, pick up the next person, or even if there's no next person, even if this is your personal vehicle, nothing stops your car from driving right back to your home and parking itself in your garage. And, it's scheduled to come pick you up again after work. No need for parking, right? I think that would make all vehicles as convenient as Uber is, and the best case. This is, though, a technological reform carried out by, a transformed city layout. And there is a case that cities are technologically obsolete, but I still think that the political struggle of transforming countries politically must be carried out in cities. It must happen in cities. I struggle to think of any sort of political or cultural change in the last 200 years that did not come from cities, like anywhere in Western history, but even Chinese history, right? Like Mao might go to the countryside to, get the peasants radicalized, become a political party. But Mao's basically educated in Western schools and spends most of his youth, visiting cities. That's where the political party of China originates. And that's like the closest case I know of where sort of the countryside was the basis for a kind of political transformation of a country.
That makes sense. Is there anything else related to cities or this piece or the broader sort of cities, effort under Palladium that's worth sharing before we wrap?
Well, on June 21st, Palladium magazine will be releasing issue 14. In this edition, the title is Great Cities. It focuses on reimagining the American city and on the political, social, and cultural problems in those cities and their hopefully bright future. So I encourage listeners and viewers to subscribe. If you want to get that edition, you're still in luck. There's still time.
Awesome. Well, let's wrap on that. Samo, as always, a great conversation. And until next week.
Until next week. Thank you, Erik.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries. Live Players is a production of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Moment of Zen. Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at eric@turpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.